Okay, so Barbara Dorsey has moved on. She went through Taffler, Major Terry, did not last very long, and now she's moved on to Robert Ross. And she resumes her pattern of discarding one soldier once he is wounded for the next one who conforms to her ideal, right? So he's put on this pedestal and she worships them. And in a sort of scene reminiscent of that earlier moment when she visited Captain Jamie Villiers and Taffler was on her arm, now she's got Robert on her arm and she's visiting Captain Taffler's room. And Taffler, at this point, we know that he has lost both arms. So there's the scene on page 155 where Captain Taffler, Barbara, and Robert Ross go to visit Taffler. And then they come out, and Juliet Dorsey, the young 12-year-old, is just observing them and sort of eavesdropping on this conversation, this exchange between Robert and Taffler. And then finally, she sees him Robert Ross put his arms around Barbara's shoulders and just hold her. So they sort of bond in this moment. It's the start of their romantic affair, and it's again a way for Robert and Barbara to comfort one another during this difficult time when their friends, the ones they love, in this case Taffler, both of them love Taffler in a way. Robert as a kind of mentor figure who he's looked up to this whole time. Taffler was the man who he wanted to emulate as a young man, who taught him how to be a soldier. And Barbara, worshipped him in a sort of hero worship kind of way. And then finally we get the revelation that Taffler also sort of succumbs to a kind of depression. Juliet Dorsey accidentally walks into his room after Barbara and Robert have left, and Taffler's in the middle of trying to kill himself. And this is at the bottom of page 155, Juliet Dorsey recalling that moment. There wasn't any answer, so I knocked again and just went in. I wish I hadn't, and I'm glad I did. I guess it saved his life, but I don't think I'll be forgiven for that. Captain Taffler didn't want to live, and in my bungling way I made him. Why do I always end up being mean, no matter what I do? He was kneeling on the floor in a pool of unraveled bandage with his forehead touching the stones. The end of the bandage was in his teeth. One of the walls was covered with great wide swipes of red at shoulder height, where he must have been rubbing his wounds to make them bleed. The stumps were where his arms had been raw, and one of them was pumping blood in spurts across the floor. And then further down, Captain Taffler's had an operation and will live, but I'm not allowed to go into the wards anymore, so I sent him flowers by Robert Ross. So we have young Juliet Dorsey sort of stumbling across Captain Taffler in the midst of a suicide attempt where he's rubbing his wounded arms, the stumps against the wall. And then trying to make himself bleed, so he'll bleed out and then die. So this is kind of a desperate act of depression, and he just wants to end his life at this point. And then Juliet Dorsey stumbles upon this and calls for the nurse to come and help save his life. But this dramatic moment sort of reveals how Taffler how he experiences the aftermath of war. So he doesn't want to live anymore. His body has been completely transformed, destroyed, and we can recall some of those instances in the previous instances where Taffler's character has been depicted. And there's some reminiscence of those in the description of him trying to commit suicide. You have him kneeling on the floor in a pool of unraveled bandages with his forehead touching the stones. So his character has always been sort of associated with stones. He was the one throwing stones, killing bottles, right? So his character is like that stone. And the end of the bandage was in his teeth. So it's kind of a uh, kind of recalls that episode in the brothel as well, where he is engaged in a kind of violent sexual act, holding the reins in his mouth like a horse. So you also get that instance also recalled in this scene. But we have a depiction of the extent to which the war has destroyed his life, and his suicide attempt is, evidence of that. So how the war not only destroys your body, but also destroys your will to live. Um, and we have Robert also sort of coming into his own as a man. So he no longer is in Taffler's shadow, so to speak. He has sort of usurped him and as sort of the war hero of this moment. And you can see that as Barbara has chosen him as her new boyfriend. So after this point, Barbara and Robert Ross, their romantic affair occurs, and Juliet Dorsey at this time, she recalls being very sort of jealous of Barbara because as a 12-year-old, again, she sort of has these kind of a girlish crush on Robert Ross, and she kind of resents her sister for dating all these men and sort of being a little bit callous or cold in the way she treats them. And we have some interesting glimpses at Robert's character as well. At the bottom of 156, we see his temper is still apparent, and there's indications that he has also, he's no longer the innocent man that he used to be, right? He's been touched by the violence as well. So this is at the bottom of 156. Robert, I discovered, was a very private man. His temper, was terrible. Once, when he thought he was alone and unobserved, I saw him firing his gun in the woods at a young tree. It was a sight I'd rather not have seen. He destroyed it absolutely. Other times he would throw things down and break them on the ground. He broke his watch that way. I don't know why, but he had a great deal of violence inside, and sometimes it emerged this way with a gesture, and other times it showed in his expression when you found him sitting alone on the terrace or staring out the window. Still, he was not at all times angry when alone, and it says here, Robert went running today. I watched him, and so did Barbara. He was running in the paddock. We'd gone down with Clive in honor to see the new foal in the barns. Coming out, we saw that Robert was running with the horses. So Robert, we get another glimpse at his character. So she acknowledges that he has this private uh, temper, right? So behind closed doors, Robert is dealing with a lot of anger. And there's some symbolic imagery in this scene. So shooting his gun, absolutely destroying the young tree. So that young tree could maybe represent as a sort of symbol of youth and innocence, right? So he was once like that young tree just growing up, and then that kind of, he sees that as being destroyed. And then throwing things down, breaking them on the ground. He broke his watch. The fact that it's a watch could also be a representation of how time has passed, how he has changed as a person. So in terms of that Bildungsroman coming of age narrative arc that we've been talking about, at this point Robert Ross is, no longer the sweet young boy that he started out being in the novel. He has grown up, experienced death and horror and, horror beyond our imagination, unspeakable things, and lost so many friends, right? So he's already lost Rodwell. Taffler has tried to commit suicide. Levitt has sort of succumbed to shell shock, and Harris has also died. So there's, innumerable men, his friends surrounding him have passed away. Robert's still alive, and he clings to Barbara D'Orcy. They bond, both of them trying to deal and come to terms with the loss of their friends. So they bond with one another. The last episode that's included in Juliet D'Orcy's diary is the scene where she accidentally walks in while Barbara and Robert are making love, and she doesn't quite understand what's going on, and she reflects on the violence of the scene. So again, we have an instance that recalls Robert's experience in the brothel, where Robert accidentally or was forced to watch. So he was in the position as an observer, and then he witnessed Taffler in the other room with the male prostitute. In this case, we have a sort of parallel scene where Julia D'Orcy is watching, accidentally coming upon her sister and Robert engaged in sort of sexual affair, and she's the one who's in the sort of position of innocence, and she can't quite make sense of what's going on. She thinks it looks violent, and it's again, she's a 12-year-old seeing something she doesn't quite understand. And it's a moment which also sort of is symbolic in the way that this is a moment where she would lose some measure of her innocence, right? So that childlike world view or childlike perception that she has is somewhat changed after this moment, because she has a new knowledge of sexuality that she didn't have before. So she reflects on this moment in her diary, and it makes her cry and feel sort of scared and alone. And then she's in this awkward stage in her childhood where, you know, she kind of is surrounded by grown-ups, men and women, her sister, and all these soldiers who are wounded. So she's surrounded by mature situations, death, suicide, violence, sexuality, and she can't quite understand any of it because she's still sort of stuck in this transition period where she's still a child technically at 12 years old, but she's again approaching a time when she will grow up quickly through her adolescence. And it's a kind of, it refers back to Robert's transformation as a character as well. He's somewhat innocent when we first meet him, and then he will grow and mature in terms of his identity as time goes on. And then Juliet D'Orcy is comforted by her brother Clive, and he tells her, he says, or she asks, why are Robert and Barbara so afraid? And Clive said, everybody they love has died. And I said, everybody dies. And Clive said, yes, but everybody isn't killed. Then I said, that's why Lady Sorrel lights her candles, isn't it? So the Earl of Bath won't perish. And Clive said, yes. He said that in a way, being loved is like being told you don't have to die. And I said, yes, but it doesn't save you, does it? And he said, no, but it saves your sanity. Then I said, are you afraid? And he said, yes. And then I didn't cry anymore because he smiled. So this exchange between Juliet D'Orcy and her older brother sort of clarifies some of what she's been experiencing or observing in her sister's behavior and Robert's behavior. She maybe gains more insight into how being loved is a way to cope with and keep your sanity in times where everybody you know has died and been killed. And Clive refers to it as a murder, right? Not everybody dies, but not everybody is killed so violently. So there's something about that that traumatically changes somebody.